You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core podcast. I am UrzaMaster. With me, as always, is Lord Uther, and joining us today from Beverly Hills, Lieutenant Bogomil, our resident guest host expert. And we are talking, I feel like I say this every week, but we are talking two of the finest episodes of Star Trek again this week from the original series. We're going over The Conscience of the King and Balance of Terror. Two, shall we say, Shakespearean episodes of Star Trek, very rooted in classical acting and very much highbrow, even for Star Trek, shall we say. I'm not going to steal Lieutenant Bogomil's thunder here, but I have to say the performances in these two episodes might be defining performances for the entire Star Trek series. For a couple of characters, and certainly formative. And I can't wait to hear everyone's thoughts. But I want to remind everybody, because right now about 96% of you out there are not subscribed to Pending Rebrand, where of course you are likely viewing this podcast. Go ahead and click below, hit that subscribe button, make sure to click notifications so you can stay up to date with all of our shows and our plethora of other material that comes out, either for a laugh, to argue with us on our podcast reviews, or to stay up to date with things like Cut the Cheese, Poke the Bear, the Meltoff podcast, the Graying Jedi podcast, and us here at the Warp Core podcast. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining this morning, and thank you all out there. Drop us a comment and let us know your thoughts on these episodes, and for that, I will say, let's turn it over to Lieutenant Bogomil.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And again, thanks to all of you tuning in for another exciting chapter of the Warp Core podcast. This morning, let's begin with The Conscience of the King, a title taken from Act 2 of Bill Shakespeare's Hamlet. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. This episode aired on December 8th, 1966. It was directed by Gerd Oswald. Good German name. Gerd was best known on the big screen for the 1956 film noir A Kiss Before Dying. And I believe it was remade into a very forgettable Matt Dillon remake in 1991. No offense to Matt Dillon, he's good in anything. But that picture, the 1991, I would skip and stick to the classic 56 original. He also dabbled in American television, including, in addition to Star Trek, Perry Mason, Bonanza, The Outer Limits, and The Fugitive with Richard Kimball pursuing the one-armed man.
Now that is a list.
I'm telling you. It was written by Barry Trivers, and Barry also was steeped in television, liked to do 70s crime shows. His credits included Mannix, The Streets of San Francisco with Michael Douglas and Carl Malden, and Kojak with Telly Savalas, Who Loves You, Baby? So this was... and it's fitting since this episode revolves around a series of crimes, a serial killing spree, if you will, perpetrated by a troupe of Shakespearean actors in the 23rd century. This was the final appearance in the order of shooting, not necessarily the final appearance, I actually believe that's the next episode we're going to be talking about, of Grace Lee Whitney as Yeoman Rand. This was the final one that she actually was paid to be on the set, although again I think the next episode we're going to talk about was shot prior to this. And so you just get a real brief glimpse of her, I believe, on the bridge. And it's kind of funny if you know the backstory, because when Rand comes on, she shoots a dirty look at this week's guest star, Barbara Anderson, who's playing Lenore. And it's quick, but if you go back and watch it, obviously Grace Lee Whitney was having none of this because she didn't have any lines or any meaningful scenes in this. And so she just shot a dirty look to the young, pretty, blonde guest star as she made her way off camera. And it is funny if you do know the backstory. Poor Grace Lee Whitney. Don't forget, it does have a happy ending. She does return to us in Star Trek the Motion Picture, although she's somewhat complicit in a transporter accident that robs the Enterprise of their science officer, which, again, starts a long domino effect that leads us back to our favorite Vulcan reuniting with them mid-mission. But you can go back and watch Star Trek the Motion Pictures segment on the Warp Core podcast, the very first launching, episode 1.
Pilot.
To hear all the juicy details there. So this was also the last appearance of Lieutenant Kevin Riley. You will remember him as the delightful Irish ham in The Naked Time, and Bruce Hyde continues to beef it up. Although, to be fair, in this one, he does try to play it a little more straight. But yes, we will miss Lieutenant Riley, who gets transferred to engineering in this particular episode. And if you have eagle sharp ears, you will hear the voice of Gomez, the Addams family's John Aston, who does not make an on-camera appearance, but he is the voice of Captain Daly talking with Captain Kirk. And John Aston has a very distinctive timbre, baritone, and so it's fun to listen to him say, "Sure, Jim, whatever you need." So I believe at the time, Addams Family may have been, in production and so forth, and someone just said, "Hey, can you read a couple of lines here off camera?" And he did, and that was a lot of fun. In addition to Barbara Anderson playing Lenore, Arnold Moss plays Anton Peridian, a.k.a. Kodos. And what this kind of sets up, don't forget, 1966 versus 2023, we just revisited this ground in Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And that's kind of where I wanted to begin the discussion, because you can see, obviously, this is the genesis of this, storyline, story trope that we've seen in other shows too. But Star Trek has covered this ground originally here, and then later in the revamp of the show. That episode, Under the Cloak of War, and we talked about that in our Strange New Worlds segment on the Warp Core. The idea that somebody is obscured their past or turned away from their past and is trying to have a new life, and do they deserve a new life? And we went into the philosophical underpinnings of that, but I was struck by sort of how effective this original episode was in conveying that, even for an audience of 1966, even one where you didn't have anti-heroes and the Don Drapers were not a fixation of modern television at the time. Television was black and white. Villains were villains. They wore black hats. Good guys rode white horses. You could tell who the good guys and the bad guys were. And I think Star Trek deserves a lot of credit for trying to shift the playing field and trying to introduce some of those ambiguities and shades of gray into characterizations. But I wanted to briefly touch on the idea of Kirk versus Kodos, and then M'Benga confronting his nemesis from the Klingon War. And personally, which, like I said, as much as I admired Under the Cloak of War and thought it was a bang up Strange New Worlds episode, I was thoroughly engaged with Conscience of the King, particularly with the twist ending, in the sense that we find out it is not Caridian who is responsible for this madness, but his deranged daughter. And he's horrified to discover her role in all of this. And what could have, again, seemed over the top and corny and so forth there, it actually lands really strong with Lenore. Like, she is, the lengths that she's willing to go to protect her father's reputation, to conceal his past, and so forth. She makes for a very effective guest star and a very effective villainess of this piece. Once all the players fall into place there. So, gentlemen, let's start there with the twist ending, and any thoughts you had this vis-a-vis the more modern Under the Cloak of War in terms of how it stands out.
Well, I happen to be a Shakespeare junkie, and so The Conscience of the King for me not only was a great reference, but this plays out like a modern interpretation of a Shakespeare play. It has all of the elements, all of the complexities. This is something that you could easily study in a college course when it comes to characterization and many of the things that are going on in here. Very similar to the ways I studied Shakespeare plays in college. And this, not only the writing here, but the acting was just outstanding. I mean, you can tell that these are classically trained actors. They're on television, yes, but they're not like TV actors as we maybe come to know later in the 90s and early 2000s, where some of those actors are, I don't know, off-the-shelf cheddar cheese kind of actors. Nothing against television actors necessarily. It's a hard job, don't get me wrong. But these are definitely people who have, there's a reason why it's like the golden era of television and the golden era of Hollywood. These are actors with tremendous chops that, frankly, are too big for the small screen, but somehow bring those elements of stage and silver screen to the black and white TV era, or, if you're lucky enough, the color TV era. And it's amazing. And the writing with the twist ending, very Shakespearean, very much, a Lady Macbeth kind of twist to the whole thing. And I eat it up. I don't think you get TV quite so compelling these days. That's something that I think modern television kind of aspires to, but the writers are somewhat lazy. I mean, we tend to tip off our audience as to who's the bad guy too soon. I think of our tense dramas that we see, because this is a tense drama of an episode. You look at a Law and Order episode, you pretty much know who the bad guy is from the first cold open, and then you get your rolling sequence, and then it's really more about, kind of the crew of the Enterprise for those episodes. They're solving the crime, but in this case, you really don't have full nuance over who's the bad guy or what's really happening, and it's lost on modern audiences. You don't quite get that, and the shows you do get that on are the ones that win all the awards. So kudos to the writers in 1965-66 that are generating this material, because this is a timeless episode of television. This is one of the reasons, among many, that Star Trek has lasted this long, is episodes like this. They are universally accessible. There's nothing about this episode that is not approachable in any language, in any culture or country. This is a story that could easily play out in most idioms and be compelling in one way, shape, or form. So the other thing I'd like to say is that, with John Astin having his minor cameo in this episode, How about television production of this era? Like, where you could just grab anybody off the lot and say, "Hey, can I borrow you for 5 minutes?" And it wasn't a matter of, "Well, give me $15 million." Like,
Right.
it was so much
Collaborative and
a collaborative atmosphere. Yeah, and this is where this great art comes from. And I'm not dissing today's, I mean, people should be compensated fairly. I believe in that very strongly. But when you have true collaboration, with or without the monetary reward, because a lot of these folks are thinking, well, it's TV, how long is this really going to last? My money's in pictures or my money is on the stage. You could really move a lot of boulders by grabbing these giant names off the lot and having them cameo into something. And we still get cameos today, but they're almost kind of like, what does Lord Uther like to say? They're almost like sprinkling a lot of cheese on. And we love cheese here at the Warp Core Podcast
yes, we do.
in all its forms, glorious forms. But it's a little bit almost like too gauche these days to like be like, oh, we've got Josh Brolin guest starring in an episode of Family Guy. Why? Well, why not? Although, don't get me wrong, Family Guy does it really well. But I think it's something to say about a show that's really still trying to make a name for itself. And we're only, 13, 14 episodes in. This show has not even established itself yet. It's taking the world by storm by the time this episode airs, but it's uniting forces from all over the walks of writing life and acting life, and somehow making this like lightning in a bottle type thing. And I think it's the diversity that really shines through. It's not just Gene Roddenberry's vision, although that's a tremendous part of it. That's, you get his vision plus the diversity of what you're bringing to the table, and my goodness, are you getting great TV.
I should have paid attention more in my high school class when they talked about Shakespeare, because I don't know anything about it except for Romeo and Juliet, which I didn't understand half of what they were saying in that either. But anyway, the one thing that sticks out to me is just you can tell when actors are classically trained, right? Like there's a huge difference, or you can tell when they come from the stage, and I think over the years, you've seen some actors that have probably started in film and then they go to stage for a while and they come back to film and they're almost different actors because they've cut their chops on that, and I think that's something that's important. And I think that is something you see a lot, not just in Star Trek during this time period, but you see a lot of those people having some kind of classically trained acting that they do. And that's what makes... You can tell those people that are on Star Trek, because I think that's what makes the show stick out. That's part of the acting that comes along with it. I like this episode a lot too. Just the whole, the intrigue and who could it be kind of thing. It probably saves money too on production costs when you're not blowing up other ships, or especially when we see the next episode that's about to come up. They probably dumped all their money into that one. My question to the two of you, I'm kind of thinking about this, because UrzaMaster, you just brought up the idea that Star Trek kind of starts exploding or growing at this time in terms of audience. Do you think, and it makes me think of Twin Peaks, because that one takes off like a rocket almost immediately. So do you think it's better to have your show take off like a rocket and then decline kind of quickly, or is it better to have like a Seinfeld or a Next Gen approach where it takes a couple of seasons, but it kind of ramps up, and then it's this steady, consistent output of material? I'm trying to figure out which one's better, because when you're a Twin Peaks fan, you're a Twin Peaks fan for life, right? Like, you never let that go. And then we kind of see some of that with TOS, that it peaks pretty quick and then obviously fades away, but then it comes back again, because you're gripped into it those first, half a season or whatever it is. So what's better?
I want to take a moment to tell a little tangent story here that underlies Lord Uther's point almost brilliantly.
Please do.
And this just happened. This is an actual. This is not based on real life. This is real life. This just happened on Thursday, October 12th. So my long-suffering partner works for a major entertainment corporation that also has theme parks and the happiest place on earth. And the CEO of said company is a man named Robert Iger, who's been on the news with the Writers Guild and SAG-AFTRA strikes as one of the negotiators for the studio side and so forth. He's had a very long and distinguished career. His accomplishments include acquiring Pixar and Lucasfilm and Marvel and so forth. So he's done a lot to bolster the bottom line. But when he got his start, he was just a lowly television executive at ABC, which coincidentally is also owned by this mega entertainment company. And one of his first jobs was the shepherding, the approval process, all of that, the green lighting of Twin Peaks. He was responsible at ABC's side for getting that on the air and, shepherding it through its 2 very bright, very brief seasons on television on ABC with David Lynch and Mark Frost. Anyways, my long-suffering partner gets into an elevator on Thursday trying to go home from work, and the only other person in the elevator is the CEO of the company, Robert Iger. No one else there, no way to distract. And they're only going to share a few brief moments between floors when presumably one of them is going to get off. So as a joke, when she took this job a couple of years ago, I said, if you ever run into Bob Iger, I said, you should tell him how much you loved Twin Peaks. And that'll floor him, because most people will just be like, oh, Mr. Iger, you're so cool, can I get a selfie? And, of course, that she was never going to do this until it happened on Thursday. And the first thing that she said to him is, I just want you to know how much I thought Twin Peaks was extraordinary. And according to her account, he was absolutely gobsmacked in this elevator that a random employee he's never met before is praising him for a show he worked on 35 years ago. And he said, and this is where it all ties into Lord Uther's story, he said, that was honestly the most exhilarating moment in my entire career. Because Twin Peaks, yes, he's telling this to a complete stranger, and this is a guy, again, that has run the world's largest entertainment media company and has, acquired giant parts of the library and the collection. But to go back and say that was the most exhilarating part of his career, because Twin Peaks did take off like a rocket, and burned very bright and made the cover of Time magazine and was on everybody's lips at the water cooler for its 2-year run before it faded away and then was reborn. And so I think with Star Trek here, to answer your point, I think it is better to immediately make that splash, not unlike a certain chanteuse who's currently all over your sports feeds when you're trying to catch up on the pigskin. It'll burn out faster, granted, and the half-life can be debated. But when you've got literally people who don't watch science fiction television talking about Star Trek, as was likely the case in 1966, or people who don't watch football talking about that certain chanteuse, and her dating proclivities. Like, when you can capture that kind of audience buy-in, I think that's, even if the Seinfelds of the world or other shows that took more of a slow simmer, the X-Files, took a couple of seasons to really ramp up in terms of that. Yes, in the long term, that's exactly what you would want. But I think if you can come out and be on the cover of Time magazine, Google that, younger audiences, if you don't know what Time magazine or a magazine was. Those are very exciting artifacts to familiarize yourself with. I think if you can get that kind of attention early, that's where you become immortal, right? I mean, I don't know how many. I think Nirvana only had the 2 commercial albums, not their Sub Pop stuff, but the mainstream label albums before, But you're never going to forget Kurt Cobain and that band if you're of that generation and know it. James Dean is still a legend, and he's only, got a handful of pictures under his belt. So for me, yes, it would be great to have a 30-year career, but if you can burn bright like that, like I say, they'll never forget you. Your name will always be in lights. What do you think, Urza?
First of all, that's a fantastic Bob Iger story.
I was
A
Which
person
you
I
only
can.
find here on the Warp Core podcast.
Yeah, you heard it here
What kind of
first.
content?
Bob Iger says the rest of his career doesn't matter. Twin Peaks was number one. Just kidding. But no, I totally agree. I think the idea of riding that rocket ship, right? And we see that with a lot of our favorite people in Hollywood and a lot of our favorite shows. It's brief, but it's beautiful. I think of the first 4 seasons of the show Sliders, which I can never talk about enough because it was fantastic. And if you haven't seen it, you are lesser for it. You need to go out and check it out. We're, of course, big sci-fi fans here, so, I'm being a little facetious. But, I think that's the stuff legends are made out of. The brief flash in the pan stuff that becomes cult favorites, the Goonies. Doom for the PC. These are things that they didn't necessarily have the clout that a Marvel franchise has behind it. They don't have the staying power of Law and Order, but they will forever stand in the halls of television or whatever as absolutely fundamental to the future. Therefore, that's I can't imagine as an actor, a writer, or a performer, or an artist, a programmer, whatever it is you do, that's kind of the thing you aspire to. Because you can make a very successful franchise and, it lasts for 15 years. I think of Supernatural. Huge following, wonderful series. But you're always going to get those folks who are like, I really liked the first 5 seasons, but after that I really didn't care. Or I really like this season and that season, but yeah, the rest of it's kind of come and go. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's the shows like Star Trek where it's like, the first 3 seasons of that franchise, the original series, absolutely wonderful. Now there's some low points later on in the series, yeah. But I don't think anybody's going to argue that the original series as a whole is TV. Without Star Trek, TV might have been the flash in the pan. I mean, that's probably an overstatement, but at least science fiction.
Yes.
At least science fiction, may have just gone, kind of just Orwellian, and that's about it, which is fine too. But I would love to be part of either, if I'm being honest. Something that's successful for 7 to 10 years, like a Next Gen or a Deep Space Nine. But to be part of something that changes the course of human history, I mean, let's be honest. Star Trek, Twin Peaks, in a way, a lot of culture has been influenced by those things. So I'm with Bob on this. I think that's the most exhilarating thing you could be part of.
Yay, Bob. Some other things.
Thanks for watching, Bob.
Yes. Some other things that must be known. Again, any pop culture reference to the Scottish play, aka Macbeth, is always welcome here. Space apartments in the future. They still have curtains. That was sort of eye-catching to me in the idea that it's the 23rd century, but you could still have very casual drapes. Also, if you find a corpse outside, is the sofa the best place to leave it? And I mean, particularly if you're going to be using the sofa in the future. I thought that entire sequence of just putting her dead husband down, like right there, and it's kind of like, well, someone's going to have to order from, Ashley or something there.
It's the big gulp moment, right?
Right.
Big gulps, huh? Well, see you later.
only Kirk, only James T. Kirk, and we're still only early in the first season, only he could have the temerity and the chutzpah to flirt with Lady Macbeth. And so that, and so that's a Bill Shatner moment there. He and Leonard Nimoy might have been quibbling, probably not, but in this episode, he barks at Spock twice to follow his orders when Spock seems to question the captain's direction, and he sort of snaps him back into place, which leads to one of our first, because we're watching these sequentially, one of our first Spock McCoy, the banter that obviously has been so prevalent over their relationship over the years. This is one of the first times where we get some of that allowed to breathe, where it's just those two in the scene and they get to go sort of trade barbs and wits and so forth. So this is an early imagining of that relationship, and it's very heartwarming for the fans because obviously we're going to see that throughout and into the big screen. But this is one of the first instances that they play with that. Uhura gets to sing and strum in the break room, and I love that Star Trek. I mean, it's just a matter of budget in terms of we have to use or reuse or redress sets. So in this case, the gymnasium turns into the ship's theater. But it makes you wonder, and I think Lord Uther probably has blueprints that can shed some light on it. But it makes you wonder just how many of these offbeat rooms the Enterprise actually has. I mean, they've got a gym, right? They've got a theater.
I know the answer.
And see, there you go.
I was looking at it's funny you say this. I was looking at some tech specs for the Enterprise, and they had a 6-lane bowling alley. Yeah, they had a 6-lane bowling alley that they said they would repurpose for different things. So that's probably where they had the gym area and the play.
But I love how whatever the needs of the story dictated, suddenly there would be a room that could facilitate.
It was just there,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, like how often was that theater room being used, if you will? I mean, again, it's fun, but I always love.
It's funny. You say that, and now it makes me think of Next Gen and how having the holodeck,
which was
really
a catch-all. That's
takes
a
care
beautiful
of a lot of that.
solution. Yeah, that's a beautiful solution that the holodeck
right.
was. Yes.
I want to know who came up with the holodeck idea. I'll leave that to you, Mr. Bogomil, for next week.
Okay, we'll dig into that as we go there.
You can do some investigating, Lieutenant.
Also, with the Shakespearean egg, I was hoping for a vial of poison, or an apothecary's little glass tube. The spray bottle was a bit jarring. It may have looked futuristic in 1966, but I was like, why are they cleaning the little spritzing there? So that made me chuckle. That boo to the prop director there for doing that. Just get a little vial of poison to go into Riley's beverage. And the interesting, if you listen to Lenore's criticisms of Kirk, the idea of the human versus a mechanized society, you're too caught up in your ship and your circuits and your computers instead of. So there was an interesting undercurrent there of even as they're flirting, of sort of romantic tension, or this idea of society, somehow that the Shakespearean troupe was in touch with their emotions and feelings, and Kirk and his crew would never understand because they were slaves to the modern society there. And again, some great dialogue by Barry Trivers. There is a stain of cruelty on your shining armor, and all the ghosts are dead. I've buried them. Were two lines that stood out for me there. So just
beautiful.
Yes, just a lot of fun, and fun with it. And like I say, we see these themes revisited in a modern context and so forth. And in the modern context, like there's more pain, there's even more pain with the M'Benga Klingon storyline, and we do take a modernist approach to the horrors of war specifically and so forth. So it's not fair to compare necessarily, but you have to give Conscience of the King props. Again, this is the height of Vietnam, or Vietnam is really ramping up at this point. So there are those tensions out there and so forth, and the idea of condoning a massacre or ordering a massacre and so forth. I'm sure that played into audience interpretation as well. So strong
Absolutely.
strong stuff. And as Lord Uther pointed out, this episode relies a lot on sets, curtains and otherwise, because they were probably hoarding some cash for what would be our second of the double bill today, Balance of Terror, which aired on December 15th, so right around the Christmas holidays, 1966. And for science fiction fans, it was a present, because this is probably, and I'll just go out on a limb here because I haven't seen the complete series run, this is probably as close to just a pure Star Wars-like episode. Star Wars, of course, would not come on for another 9 years. It's a sea battle. It's a space battle. It's a submarine movie. Your fathers would approve, because dads like
U571.
would like submarine thrillers and the like. And it was actually, they admitted freely that it was based upon The Enemy Below, which was a 1957 American destroyer hunting a German U-boat, and a very famous picture, like one that would have been, people would have recognized it. Yes,
Yeah,
if you haven't seen it, yes. But this picture, I mean, this breaks the mold of Star Trek. This is not what week in, week out Star Trek looks like, but it's it's the action-packed episode, and I don't think you're going to see the Enterprise firing off. And good to note, they had not yet invented photon torpedoes in the vernacular yet. So although you keep calling for phasers, you will note that what they really appear to be doing is shooting torpedoes, a la the Destroyer in The Enemy Below, and those would be photon torpedoes. So they hadn't quite assigned the proper vocabulary to what they were doing, but we know the difference between a phaser and a photon torpedo, quantum torpedo, whatever model they're using. And these were definitely photonish torpedoes that they were shooting, and they shot a lot of them, friends, even with the newly digitized special effects. Like this is as close as you get in the late 60s, before ILM comes on with TIE fighters and X-Wings and completely redefines, what a space battle looks like. This is what a space battle looked like before Star Wars, and it was grand, it was glorious. But don't expect that every week. This is not, most episodes will be them in rooms looking at the computer and trying to decipher what the next clues are. But this one was just, it blew it out. It was directed by Vincent McEvedy, and we've seen his work before. He directed Miri recently and Dagger of the Mind. So we just caught some of Vincent's work in a prior Warp Core installment. And the writer was, so this is his third episode of this cycle, and Paul Schneider, he was very busy as a television writer. He will later pen The Squire of Gothos, which I know Lord Uther has been referencing, the Trelane episode that's not too far away, so stay tuned, avid Warp Core fans. But Schneider, I love his credits as well. Bonanza, Marcus Welby, MD, The Mod Squad, The $6 Million Man, and I got really excited when I saw he had written a pair of Buck Rogers in the 25th Century episodes starring Gil Gerard and Wilma Deering, and Tweaky. But they were the second season, which was clearly inferior to the first, including the one, regrettably, where Buck turns into a half-man, half-horse satyr. And if you've never seen that episode before, it'll scare the living daylights out of you if you're between the ages of 6 and 9. but it's a little bit silly now. From my
I enjoyed it when I was about 8. So
yeah, so it worked then. I'm not so sure it holds up now, but let's not hold that against Mr. Schneider because Gil Gerard really did make that work, and that's a whole podcast in and of itself if we did Buck Rogers. So this episode introduced the cloaking device, which will become obviously a big thing down the road for Star Trek, and Romulans. And of course, the lead Romulan is played by actor Mark Lenard. And Star Trek fans don't need me to tell you that Mark Lenard is best known for playing the father of Spock, Ambassador Sarek. And he will go on to play that role in this series. This was his first appearance in Star Trek, but he went from a Romulan commander to then being recast as Spock's father, a role that he would play through the 6 films.
the rest of his life?
Right, the rest of his
Basically.
life in essence. The 6 films of the big screen original cast. He's also, eagle-eyed viewers, and circling back to Warp Core Episode 1, he's also the Klingon commander who meets an untimely end to the Cloud of V'ger. I believe he orders the 3 torpedoes, they blast into the cloud, and then gets it back tenfold. So, what does that do? That makes Mark Lenard the only actor in the entire canon and history of Star Trek to have played a Romulan, a Klingon, and a Vulcan. So, there you
Did
go.
not know that.
Yes, there's your Mark Lenard trivia.
Weird, wild stuff.
Exactly. And, he, of course, his distinctive voice, which we recognize as Ambassador Sarek, comes through here and gives you chills. We talk about classically trained actors and so forth, but he's, not since Lawrence Luckinbill's Cybok do you have such an instantly recognizable alien voice. That was great. He will become Sarek in a year from now in Journey to Babel. And when we cover that, we'll circle back to this episode, and it's just like a giant feedback loop, and you all will say, how do I escape the warp core? You can't. This show, just like the one we just did, The Conscience of the King and Under the Cloak of War, this has big ties to Star Trek Strange New Worlds, particularly the Season 1 finale, A Quality of Mercy, which, in effect, several of this episode's plot points are replayed with a modern perspective with James Kirk and Christopher Pike. And again, you can debate the merits, the digital effects of the future versus what we had going here. But what we had going here, again, 1966 pre-ILM, pretty darn good in terms of what they were able to communicate and capture and how far they were willing to show the effects. Because it's very easy to just say, the shields are down to 10%, Captain, and then shake the camera in the bridge. But they went for it with, the rematerializing and dematerializing Bird of Prey, and the Enterprise firing off. Even if it was the same shot of the Enterprise firing off multiple torpedoes, it still packs a relative punch. I did find the whoever detailed that Bird of Prey, I thought that was a little silly. I loved it when it was sort of a dark green, ominous shape approaching the ship. But when we saw underneath and someone had spray painted like this yellow phoenix type thing, I thought that was a bit on the nose. I would have preferred just a sleek undercarriage. But, somebody's cousin was bored on the weekend and just did hey, what do you think? That's fine. So that was
That's a good way to think of it.
Exactly. This was the final episode of Janice Rand on camera now, in not the production order. This had been shot before Conscience of the King. So she got a little bit of screen time. She even got to stand close to Captain Kirk when the Enterprise was facing imminent destruction. And it wouldn't be a Rand episode if she didn't offer to bring him some sort of meal or beverage. Stewardess Rand. I'm sorry, Grace Lee Whitney, by the way, but you did a fantastic job, and it was the time. if you could have come of age in this generation, you would have had so much more meaningful screen interactions with the captain. Besides, you looked hungry. Should I get you some food? So we have the wedding. This is the one that begins with the wedding. And I thought that was kind of, I'll throw this out to you guys. It's just kind of a brief thing. It's not necessarily one you have to spend too much brain power on. But I thought there was kind of a missed opportunity. You have this young couple that we're introduced to that are about to tie the knot, and Kirk is going to officiate this ceremony. Then they get interrupted, and the mission goes, and we actually cut back to them. She is in phaser control, which reminds me that they did move, I guess they moved phasers up to the bridge at some point, because it was kind of weird seeing it in a completely different location, because it was actually torpedoes, if you think about it. So, that makes more sense that she's down in the torpedo bay and they're loading photon torpedoes into the thing to be shot off, but I digress. And then, her fiance works there as well. And there's an emotional moment there at the end where he's perished and she's basically been orphaned and widowed by this exchange. The problem is some of the scenes given to Lieutenant Stiles, played by Paul Comey, like he gets the emotional arc of overcoming bigotry and prejudice against Spock, which is a good storyline. Let's not take anything away from Stiles. But I kind of wanted some of those scenes to go to the fiancé, because I think that really would have upped the emotional quotient of Luke, even if he's just a character that we're introduced to in the beginning of the episode and then he's dead at the end and then we feel her pain. I just felt like emotionally, I thought that the Stiles stuff was, for its time, again, bigotry, prejudice, and so forth. These are all very relevant Gene Roddenberry themes. But I don't think that landed with me from a modern era as much as the emotional through line of this young couple who thinks they're sailing off to happiness and instead there's this tragedy. So this is just the modern writer in me thinking about it. But if I had a chance to do a do-over, if Q would zap me back to the writer's room, I might explore giving that fiance another scene or an emotional beat or focus, a little bit less on the Stiles, because how many times on the Enterprise bridge are these people going to be insubordinate? Kirk is, I can't believe, and it's always that same seat next to Sulu. He's like, Jesus, where do they find these guys? It's like,
Right.
they're putting cowards up there. They're putting racists up there. It's like, I'm just trying to do my job, man, and fly the ship. But Kirk's always getting on these guys. So
It's not until they park a Russian there that anything really changes.
anything really gets done, yeah. So let's talk Stiles, let's talk fiancés, and let's talk just, again, slam bang action, Star Trek as nautical, which is something that Nicholas Meyer was very much insistent on when he took the reins for Star Trek II. The idea that the Enterprise is basically a battleship. And so in this tense cat and mouse with the Romulan, submarine, to use that metaphor, like this idea that everything kind of, goes back to Horatio Hornblower and, ships of the line and, load the torpedoes and run silent, run deep. So what do you say, UrzaMaster?
Well, I feel like this whole season that we've gone through, I always say this is fundamental Trek. This is absolutely setting the stage for everything that Trek becomes. Here we go again. We've got multiple tropes here, right? We've got the wedding that gets interrupted. We see that again in, Star Trek, is it Generations or First Contact, I think. We see that in Next Generation. We see it in Voyager. We see it in Deep Space Nine. I'm sure we'll see it again in another Star Trek in the future. And I'm sure I'm forgetting, the wedding scenes. It's kind of like pro wrestling. They have to do it every couple of years. Somebody gets married in the ring. But it's great. And I totally agree. I think it's a Yeoman Rand situation. While I'm not going to say they completely wasted that character, I think it's a product of its time, unfortunately. I think Grace Lee Whitney is grossly undercredited with being a fundamental part of what Star Trek becomes, because I think she gives us so much when she was given so little to work with. So hats off to her. I mean, that's, in a way, she took what she was given and made it something truly incredible. Likewise with our widow here in this episode, she was not given enough screen time. They could have made this all about her, and her suffering, and made it a little bit more one-dimensional of an episode, and it would have been great. And I think in Next Gen we see some things to that effect a little bit better done. But it really was the nautical episode, as you said. I think this is a tale of two captains, and we see this trope played out over and over in Star Trek, and it never gets old. It's still fresh and fun every time. It's still exciting, but this was really the Shakespearean battle of wills. Yet again, here we are. Stage meets screen. We have two classically trained actors, William Shatner and Mark Lenard, going tit for tat in their ships. This is a master and commander situation. It's very... It is incredible, and that's the story I think they wanted to tell, but they also have to make it a little bit more accessible. Like, if you made it all the nautical battle, it's too highbrow, it's too cerebral, which they got feedback on very early on. And by adding that emotional arc to it with, the newlyweds and the insubordination, of course, you're getting that kind of first branch out, right, where you're getting sort of subplot, sub-arc stories that are being told contained in the same episode. And Next Gen pulls this off to the nth degree. Not so much in the first season, but later seasons. They really start to build out, and of course in Strange New Worlds, that's really the whole series, is these layered, nuanced stories that are going on all at the same time, even though you're telling a standalone episode. I think this episode does it in such an incredibly well-designed way. And, credit to the acting, the writing, even the staging, and the sets in this episode just tell this story so incredibly well. And yet again, we have another room on the Enterprise, a room where people get married, a chapel, if you will. And it's like, they just, this Enterprise, this is
got
mysterious
everything.
and a wonderful thing. Yeah, it's got everything you could ever need, because it has to. It has to be convenient for the writing staff. I'm surprised they didn't do like an interior archery range, at some point. But it is really cool to see what would be, of course, the first time on television you see something of this scope, of course. And the nuance to which it is that blind, Unterseeboot situation that is so in vogue. I think there was a lot of intrigue, because this is about the era when that information was starting to sort of become more well-known. The whole story of what the Nazis were really doing in World War II and how close we really were to an extraordinarily dangerous situation, with their U-boats and our submarines, and the Russian submarines. We're at the height of the Cold War, Vietnam's going on. Like, this is a very poignant story. And then the idea of these battling captains who are fighting the fight they're fighting, it's very real life. In a big way, and it's very fresh in everybody's mind. You're still dealing with a lot of younger television audiences who fought in World War II at this point, who know this. And maybe the unfortunate, but I think one of the most interesting parts about this is it's completely accessible even today. This is no less poignant a story of a tale of essentially battle, a war battle, than you could tell today. You see it unfold on the global stage, unfortunately, all the time, it seems, where I think, the tale of these two captains here and what they're going through, it's so fresh and so human that, I think this is where you can get that sort of ethereal perspective of let's rise above the conflict and start to see what both sides are seeing. And this is that, I think for television, this might be groundbreaking, where you kind of get this moment where it's a meta view of conflict. And it starts to reach for these, shall we say, Roddenberry-esque ideals of the future, where you can have these contemplative sort of battle of wills, battle of the fates, where they're almost trapped in their own, concrete existence of warlike cultures, instead of being this, abstract utopian vision of the future that maybe we get more so with the next generation. And that's where I go back to the line, remember when we were just explorers? Were we ever? I mean, this starts to beg that question of, there are a lot of exploration episodes, but there are a lot of ship-to-ship battles, too. And when you start to think of the future that I think Roddenberry wanted us to aspire to, you have to realize that conflict doesn't just go away. It just changes. And this is, I know this might be a very highbrow examination of a Star Trek episode, but I think this is really a critique on the human condition. And that's something that you could do in the 60s without being like beating you over the head on the nose, that you kind of have to do today. And I'm not saying that audiences were smarter back in the day. I think it was just a little bit more learned an audience, shall we say, where people were a little more contemplative. There's a lot more book reading and a lot less Googling. No offense to modern audiences, but I think the nuance of something like this episode of television might be lost on people today, except for a very select few who value this type of craft work.
Yes.
Yeah.
So a couple things stick out in this episode. I see a lot of Wrath of Khan, right?
Yes.
Where we're ducking and dodging, we're following, we're plotting, we're trying to outthink one another. But here's where I think this is a little bit different. And this is something I try to tell my athletes a lot. Like, you have to respect your opponent. And we see a lot of that here, right? Like, I'm not going to, and I always tell my athletes too, it's a mistake to underestimate. You always need to understand that no matter what team you're playing, whether they're undefeated or they're defeated, they might be bringing their best game that day. So you don't underestimate your opponent, and you always respect your opponent and you respect the game, because those are life lessons. But we see that here. I mean, both of them are talking about, in a sense, how much they kind of respect each other, which leads me to a line that my dad had used a lot. My dad used, because my dad was in Vietnam, and he said, I really struggled with being at war because those people might have been my friends, but my government told me that's my enemy, so I had to do what I had to do. And in this episode, you hear the Romulans say, like, we might have been friends in another life, right? Like, that's so poignant. But because someone's telling them that's not the case, here we go. That's something else I try to impart upon my students and my athletes, is that you never know. And judging someone because you're told something that's been predetermined by someone else is not a very healthy thing to do. And so, we see that in this episode. So this is probably my favorite episode. This is one of the first episodes I had seen when I was younger, and just the cat and mouse game that they're playing. I loved it. And it's funny because you're talking about having phaser control down below. That's very submarine-ish, right? You're calling for torpedoes down to, if you're on a sub, you're calling and letting the people in control of that know when to fire, when to flood the tanks for the torpedo, all that stuff. And I think that's what you're seeing here. Thank goodness, that they moved it up to, because it doesn't make any sense. And you couldn't respond fast enough. Fire phasers now by the time, right? So I like that they brought it up to the bridge. But a lot of things that, I've said this before too, I love seeing the growth. Like the growth of Star Trek, we're seeing it from episode to episode to episode. These things becoming, canon with how they do things or how they speak to each other. I love seeing that growth too. So this is just lights out, great episode.
Like I say, I'm just a little surprised at how shirty Kirk can be. Like sometimes, like again, whether he's snapping at Bones, Spock, or some random crew member sitting in that seat, like he's just like, if my memory needs refreshing, I'll ask you.
But I think that's
like,
a great
I just love he's just kind of like, I'm the captain here, and if you want to go, let's step outside.
I'm going to take a step beyond that. I think it's great leadership. And I'll tell you why it's great leadership. Because he praises his people when they need to be praised, and he corrects them when they need to be corrected. It's not always correcting all the time and yelling, and it's not always praising and not correct. I think he walks. Look, as a leader, it's a very, very fine line to walk between being too much of a tough guy and giving in too much. And I think you balance that, again, by praising when it's deserved and correcting when it's needed. And that's how you get the respect. So I think that's why I respect him as a captain, even though it's not real life, but whatever. But that's why his crew respects him too, right? Like he'll back them up. He'll take the first phaser fire from someone. Like he'll jump in front of a phaser for you, but he's going to tell you when you're being a bigot or when you're just doing something wrong. Like he's going to call you out. And I think that's something that endears Kirk a lot. Like that's why we like him. Like with Picard in the first couple seasons of Next Gen, Picard came off as a grumpy old man, in my opinion. I mean, love him as a captain, but it was almost like crotchety old man syndrome, and then he kind of gets rid of it a little bit as time goes on. Here, we know why Kirk is respected. He'll put you in your place if you need it.
That's a great point. And that's really the beauty of Trek, is you get to see the growth of these characters, and you get to see really real life growth. It's something that I think maybe modern television doesn't do quite as well as, developing out really human characteristics of what is obviously a fictionalized character. Some characters on shows, they play such an archetype that it's like, well, you're, especially in this era, you're the good guy, you're the bad guy, you have to be absolutely good or you have to be absolutely bad. You don't get shades of gray often. And Kirk, even though he's quote-unquote the good guy, you do get a number of shades of gray with him, which humanizes it. And that's the beauty of Trek, I think, through and through, is that it's, in as much as you're dealing with aliens and strange new worlds and new civilizations, it's human. It's all shades of gray, morally speaking, and from a leadership perspective, from a follower perspective, scientific perspective, whatever angle you want to take on Star Trek, you're getting nuance. And that's something that, quite frankly, especially in a modern lens, is lost. There's very little nuance anymore, and it's not tolerated well in new TV shows. You kind of get, the most nuance you get is like an anti-hero, like a Deadpool, where it's almost a little too on the nose with its nuance. Like literally Deadpool will slap you in the face with a body part. What have you. It might have been just chopped off by an enemy or something. But there's something to say about the creativity of this show. It's just unparalleled, not only in its era, but even today, by today's measuring sticks. And that's really a testament. And I think that's why the Warp Core podcast can happen today, quite frankly. We are available to our pending rebrand followers and even those who are casually stopping by, who should click that subscribe button, by the way, and drop your comments. Let me know what you think. But we're able to do what we do because they did such a brilliant job then, that for as much examination has been put on Star Trek over the last 50 years, quite frankly, we could keep going. I mean, 50, 60 years, there's still stories to be told. There's still examinations to be had, not unlike Shakespeare, which heavily influenced these two episodes. And let's just say right here and now that as we move into our Warp Core evaluations of these two fine, fine episodes, I think we all know where we might be leaning. But I won't disallow suspense. I'm going to go with Lieutenant Bogomil here. Conscience of the King, Balance of Terror, out of 7 warp cores. Your score, sir.
Well, let's add them up like George Kittle would catch touchdowns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's right. Just like a David Fincher thriller. These are 2 7s across the board. I thought that Conscience of the King was my favorite episode of this original cycle that I'd seen thus far. And then I saw Balance of Terror. So, again, we're being spoiled early by the possibilities and paradigms of these episodes as they find their creative footing. And it's only later when they become Hollywood fat cats and so forth that we might see a little bit less discipline and focus. Again, I'm not trying to prejudge here, but I think you're seeing in this first season and in this first half of this first season, you're seeing the foundational trek that UrzaMaster is so fond of laying out for us, and it just is like, you don't have some of those silly escapades and asides that might drag you down later. What you just have is compelling, edge of your seat television, and that's what we get here. So, en français, 7 for both.
I guess I should have learned French too. Obviously I'm going double 7s here. This is what makes us love Star Trek, right? And to my point, which I'll say was pretty good at the beginning.
Hey.
Taking off like a rocket obviously seems to endear us a little bit more, I think, to these different shows, which we're going to have to do in my opinion, we're going to probably have to do a mini pod on series that, like, took off like a rocket and then faded away, like Firefly or something like that. So we're gonna have to do a mini pod on that at some point, or a mini. What were we calling those, Urza? Mini brands. Anyway, we'll figure it out. We're so creative here at Pending Rebrand, which is why you should click the subscribe button down below, like the hundreds and hundreds of people have done so far. You got to be a part of the club. And with the new website coming along and the newsletter that we're putting together, hey, join us, won't you? So I'm going to go 7 out of 7 for both. Again, Balance of Terror is what originally brought me into Star Trek. We see it again in Wrath of Khan, which is my favorite Trek movie. I mean, it's no Undiscovered Country or whatever that one was.
Unbekannte Land.
Or Nemesis. But, yes.
Oh, that makes me nauseous just thinking about it. It's not the 3 cups of coffee I had this morning either. It's just mentioning those 2 movies. So, yeah, 7 out of 7. Of course, I'm going to now take the rock and throw it over to UrzaMaster like it's Justin Fields to Cole Kmet. Touchdown.
Kmet.
Cole Kmet, huh?
That's kind of like that Notre Dame. Yeah, I think he's a Notre Dame guy. Kind of like the Notre Dame that defeated USC yesterday. So there we go.
I even caught a little bit of that game. More to come on the NFL on Cut the Cheese, Poke the Bear.
Yes, Gary.
Stay tuned. But obviously, I mean, come on. I don't think anybody watching this Warp Core podcast was ever going to say, "Oh, I bet UrzaMaster isn't going to give this a perfect 7." Oh, come on. This is perfect 7. We are all 7 fever today. There's not even anything else I could say. I mean, these are, again, 2 of the finest episodes of television ever to grace the small screen. I just want to make one last point about these 2 episodes, because I think I've said my piece on them, but I know growing up, I saw this in syndication for the first time, of course, like many of my generation, and those who came well after saw Star Trek, the original series. I know I was watching this in about 1992. I was 4, with my grandpa, and it was on TV somewhere in the evening. I don't know about what time. Before the color bars. Yeah, they were still a thing at the time. And it was this show, it was The Outer Limits, it was The X-Files. These were the sci-fi of my era. I think Twin Peaks may have been a thing. I don't remember it very well because I was young, and it was probably not for me. But these two episodes, I watched my grandpa enjoy very much. I watched my dad enjoy them very much. I enjoy them very much. And my two sons and my daughter are now watching these two episodes and enjoying them very much. Especially my son, Rowan. He loved Balance of Terror when we watched it. Now, he's not quite 2. So what did he love? The noises, the colors, the goofy looking ears. This for him, it's multi-generational television that will never, ever, ever lose its appeal. And I will say that Seinfeld, Twin Peaks even, The Simpsons, some of these other timeless classics that are out there, they will eventually lose their appeal. Some shows just age out of their popularity, let's say. I think of a show like Friends. I love Friends. Grew up with Friends, loved every episode. And now through the modern lens, we're finding out that some of those episodes didn't age very well. Not so with Star Trek. All of these episodes aged very well, and they hold up. And the reason being is, you can retouch and make them look sharper and clean up the image and add some digital effects, and that's all well and good. But you don't have to change a single thing about the content of these episodes, because they are truly, truly timeless. So, like our fine friend and hopefully future collaborator, Mr. Bob Iger, said, this is the most exhilarating television of our Warp Core podcast career, which is Star Trek, the original series. And hopefully one day Mr. Iger will agree to come on the show and talk Twin Peaks and maybe some Trek with us. Not going to hold my breath because I'm sure the man is quite busy. But, if you ever wanted us to record a live show at, say, the happiest place on earth, we'd be more than happy to bring the Warp Core podcast and all our pending rebrand content to the Disney franchise. We are likely to be a bargain deal for them. But, as we always do, we leave our Warp Core podcast fans and our pending rebrand fans with a hope that you'll subscribe and a very hearty live long and prosper.